I have a few. Welcome to day 3. I hope you're enjoying all of our great sexual science. I have a few new housekeeping announcements to make before we get started this morning. As always, continued thanks to our sponsors for the conference. In particular, the University of Minnesota sponsor. We haven't given a shout out yet. University of Minnesota Institute for Sexual and Gender Health paid for your lanyards today. Yes, thank you. So, okay. We have our best tweet of the day from Eva Fernandez. That she is learning so much at this conference that her brain is going to explode. Ava, if you're here, I don't. Congratulations, Ava. Ava, if you could see Dawn sometime during the conference and get your award, prize. Woohoo. All right. An important announcement, between today and tomorrow, we have the time change. So tomorrow's programming will be on standard, or will be on saving time. So everything falls back 1 hour. So for tomorrow's, all of tomorrow's events, just try not to show up at the wrong time. Don't say I didn't tell you, it was in the syllabus. Okay, we also have a really critical and important plenary tomorrow. Susan Wright, longtime Quad S member and exhibitor, will be doing our plenary tomorrow. So stick around for the last day of the conference, because that will be an important highlight. Several of you have asked. All of the plenaries are recorded and are available on the Whova app to be watched later, and you can watch them with the closed captioning on the Whova app. Okay. Let's see. Immediately after this session, we will be having our awards ceremony, so stay right where you are. There's no break. We're going to pivot right into our awards ceremony. This afternoon, we have our third poster session with dessert included, so come see our posters for this afternoon. Today, in this room, we'll also have our big annual luncheon for everyone. So stick around for lunch, wear your badge so we know that you are official. We have a symposia this afternoon at 4 o'clock from the Jedi SIG, who will be presenting on putting anti-oppressive principles into practice. Okay. Tonight we have our big social event at 5:30, again right here in the Pavilion Ballroom, sponsored by Adam and Eve. Thank you, Adam and Eve. And we'll have entertainment and food and the whole 9 yards. So don't miss that. Don't make reservations other places. You need to stay here. All right, and with that, we'll start our awards. I'll invite Christine to come up and introduce and give our scientific award. Yep.
Thank you, everyone. I have been the awards chair for the past couple of years, and it is my honor to introduce, and I'll say a couple of words and then you can come up, Dr. Erin Devor, who was chosen for the Distinguished Scientific Achievement Award and nominated by SOGI. So Dr. Erin Devor is an internationally recognized leader in transgender studies. Oh, wait. What button do I push here? The green one? Yeah, the green, the big green one. There it is. That one, there's two. Okay. Dr. Devor is an internationally recognized leader in transgender studies who's been studying and teaching about transgender topics since the early 1980s. He's established and holds the first world the world's first chair in transgender studies. He's initiated and hosts the International Interdisciplinary Moving Trans History Forward Conference, and he's founded and is the subject matter expert for the world's largest transgender archives. He's published widely on transgender topics, including authored or co-authored 55 book chapters and scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals, 4 books, 9 book reviews, and has co-edited 1 book. His 1989 book, Gender Blending: Confronting the Limits of Duality, was the first book to describe what would now be called non-binary genders. His 1997 720-page classic, FTM, Female to Male Transsexuals in Society, was the second book ever about trans men and the first based on non-clinical field research. Other influential works includes a widely cited model of transgender identity development and the Lambda Literary Award nominee, the Transgender Archives Foundation for the Future, about the transgender archives at the University of Victoria. He's also been an author of versions of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health Standards of Care since 1999, and has been guiding the translation of version 7 into world languages. Dr. Devor's opinions are frequently sought by the media. He's delivered more than 40 keynotes and plenary addresses to audiences around the world, and he's received numerous awards for his research and advocacy work. He is a national award-winning teacher, which I appreciate as a teacher, and the Fellow of the Society. Dr. Devor is a former Dean of Graduate Studies and Professor of Sociology at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. So I welcome you to the stage so I can give you your award, and I am so excited to hear your talk today. So this is all for you.
Wow.
This is your title, and this is your award. And thank you so much. You want to get a picture?
He's taking pictures. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's a
Of
big
course.
pile of things here,
Yeah,
folks. It's
cookies and everything. So
a
you
good
can
thing I
take
have
care
some
of
room in my
it.
suitcase. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It's a huge honor. Technology takes a moment to get started. While this warms up, I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to Quad S, to the board for this award, to the awards committee, to many people in Quad S who have supported this nomination. I'm hugely honored to have this opportunity to speak to you. And I want to say a special shout out to the SOGI committee, who I know have been my fans and supporters. Okay, so let's get this up on the screen. There we go. All right, so I've entitled my talk, Trans Plus Research from Obscurity to Everywhere. I use Trans Plus as a shorthand. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different identities that people use that might fall under a trans umbrella of some sort. I don't have enough time to recite them all, so I'll just use Trans Plus as a shorthand. And I say from obscurity to everywhere because when I started this work in the early 1980s, I had to explain to people what the words were, what I was talking about. It was not a known quantity. And now I'm sure you're all aware that hardly a day goes by where you don't see something in the media about trans. Everybody knows the words, everybody's talking about it, everybody's trying to understand better what it's all about. So when I started the research, well, first of all, let me do a territorial acknowledgement. So I acknowledge with respect the Musqueam people on whose traditional territories this hotel stands and whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. So when I started doing this work, I was a first-year master's student, and I thought, oh, this is going to take a couple of years to finish a master's degree. In Canada, you actually do research, and you have to have a project, and you write a thesis. And I thought, what could possibly hold my attention for a couple of years? And, well, I was a gender non-conforming person myself, and it seemed to create a great deal of consternation in the people around me And so I thought, okay, let's look at that for a couple of years. Well, here I am 40 years later, and I'm still finding it somewhat interesting, and people are still having a lot of consternation about what is this with these gender nonconforming, gender different, gender diverse, gender fluid, all different kinds of trans plus people. So in my research, it's multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and I've picked out a few themes. I wanted to give you a short overview. When I was invited to do this talk, I said, what should I talk about? And well, it's a research award, so talk about your research was the reply. I said, well, the current stuff? And they said, well, it's a kind of a career research. So I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of my whole research career, pick out a few highlights, and I've put it into these themes. It's about identities, it's about sexualities. Reed Erickson is somebody I've studied quite a lot. If you don't know who he is, you're going to find out. And I feel like it's always important to give back, and so I do quite a bit of policy work more in recent years, and a lot of knowledge communication to bring back to the communities and to pay back for my salary, which is publicly funded. I work at a public university. It's taxpayer dollars, and I feel like I owe the taxpayer something back. So I do a lot of public communication, and of course I'm trying to build for the future because I'm not going to go on forever, and I want to make it possible for other people to do the work alongside of me and after I'm finished doing my work. So let me start with talking a little bit about trans identities, the pathway, how do you get from here to there. As you just heard, one of my first book was called Gender Blending. So this is what grew out of that master's research. So I was a gender different person at the time. I'm still a gender different person, but not so obviously as I was then. And I thought, well, I'm going to try and figure out what's going on. And so I interviewed a bunch of people who were all identified as women or as females. And when they went out into the world, people thought that they were men. So we didn't have words for what that was. In fact, pretty much everybody I spoke to said, I have never talked to anybody about this before. It was like a big secret that this happened to them and somewhat shameful for them. So I did the interviews, I wrote up my master's thesis, and then I turned it into this first book. And I had to make up a word. What's going on? We didn't have non-binary, which I think would have been a good term for what was going on there. So I called it gender blending. We didn't use binary to describe gender in the way we do today, and so the subtitle was Confronting the Limits of Duality. And I want to read to you, or you can read along with me, the concluding paragraph of that book. And I've updated the language a little bit to reflect the way we talk about it today, but I've left in the old ones and crossed it out. So here's how that book finished. Full acceptance of non-binary genders could serve as a transitional step between the present gender binary and a future state wherein the concept of gender would become obsolete and meaningless. Gender as we think of it now is an artifact of sex. Were gender to become divided from sex, it would begin to lose its meaning, and it would become impossible to use gender as the basis for sex discrimination. Were full acceptance of non-binary genders to become a goal and increasingly a reality in society, the basis for gender as a meaningful concept would become irreparably eroded. Were people to become no longer socially distinguishable on the basis of sex, were all gender choices open to all people, were there to cease to be a cognitive system which measured the world in gendered units, the material basis for a social system based on binary gender would cease to exist. So that was my vision back in 1989. And I feel like I'm starting to see it come to fruition now. And I'm very pleased to see the world changing in this direction. You also heard in the introduction that I then, my next big output was this book, 720 pages. It took me 10 years to do it. It was not my PhD dissertation. I did get a PhD, but this was a separate project that started at the same time but lasted longer. It's the second research book on trans men, and the first one that was a non-clinical, non-pathologizing research book based on interviews. A huge portion of the book is their own words, is interviews with trans men. And when I started doing the work, they were thrilled to work with me because nobody had taken any interest in the research community in trans men before I started doing this work. So I want to give you a little quote from this. It was first published in 1997. It was reissued in 2016. And this is from the introduction I wrote in 2016. I had a new introduction and a new foreword. The rest of the book was the same. So the challenges for the generation of trans men in this book were simply to achieve tolerance. Today's generation of trans and non-binary people are busily bringing about greater acceptance. The next generation's tasks will be to bring us to indifference, to a time when being trans or non-binary will raise neither eyebrows nor hackles, to a world where all people will be judged only on the content of their character rather than on their gender expression, a world where the full spectrum of gender expression is available to all and of only benign social consequence. So that vision was not in the 1997 version, that was in 2016. And again, we're waiting for that world to come about, but it's starting to happen. So continuing the trans identities themes, I wanted to walk you again very briefly, very superficially, through some of the other work I've done in this area. So Annual Review of Sex Research is a product of the Quad S, and so I had the honor of doing an article in that back in '97, which was around the same time as that book came out, and I called it Female Gender Dysphoria, Personal Problem or Social Problem. And you know, the language has changed a lot. This is a theme you'll see when through me talking about my work, and I can't change the language we used then, and I hope people are not offended to see it coming forward. This is the language we use. So female gender dysphoria referred to people who were assigned female at birth. So I looked at this, I looked at different ways of understanding gender dysphoria, and I broke it into gender role dysphoria, so unhappiness about roles, unhappiness about identity, unhappiness about body, sex dysphoria. And then I looked at, well, how intense is that and how does that play out? And so just briefly, again, I don't have the time to go into any of this in great detail. For instance, mild kind of gender dysphoria would just be about gender role, and that might be something you'd see in feminists. Don't like the role, but I'm happy to be a woman, I'm happy to be female. Intermediate, we might see some gender identity dysphoria, but no desire to transition. And when you get into the higher or extreme levels, then people are saying, I don't like the roles, I don't like the identity, I don't like the body, I want to transition. So I was trying to make a little bit of more nuanced sense of how this was understood at the time. Now, this is 1997, so how many years ago was that? That's a lot of years ago. Continuing this one, a little more recent, but still a while back. I'm trying to understand, how do people go through these stages? How do people understand themselves? And I published an article called Witnessing and Mirroring. So people need to be seen. They need to be witnessed. And they also need to have who they are mirrored back and see other people like themselves. And so I looked at how this works, and I put up on the screen just the names of the different stages, but I developed a model and I said, look, these are stages that often people go through. Not everybody goes through every stage. Not everybody goes from the beginning to the end. Some people go back and forth. So I'm not trying to say that this is the only way it can happen and it has to happen exactly this way, but these are common pathways and common steps that people go through in figuring out who they are. Now, much more recently, two articles that were really led by a brilliant undergraduate student who's now just in their first year of a master's program called Kai Jacobson. And one of them was looking at Tumblr posts when Tumblr was the place where people were really fighting out transnormativity, and looked at the arguments on either side of who counts as trans and what the community itself was saying back and forth and arguing about. Very, very interesting analysis. And then also with Kai Jacobson, this is something I want to get people to think about more. This is a 2022 article. Moving from gender dysphoria to gender joy. So we've had decades and decades and decades of talking about gender dysphoria, talking about trans plus people as being in pain and having these very, very difficult and horrible lives. And it's time to start recognizing that trans plus people transition because life is better on the other side for them, whatever that other side means for them. Okay? It's not always strictly a binary transition by any means. But people transition because it gives them joy. it gives them pleasure, it gives them a better life. And so we need to talk more about that aspect of what's going on. And in this article, we talked about both joy and euphoria. So those little moments that a person has when, finally someone sees me the way I see myself, that's a euphoric moment. But you can't stay in euphoria forever. And so it settles into a more long-term sense of joy or happiness at being who you are. So I recommend this article to you. Now, very current activities. I'd like to bring to your attention this project that I've been working on. The larger project is part of something called the LGBTQ+ Oral History Collaboratory. It's headed up by Professor Elspeth Brown at the University of Toronto. And one piece of it that I worked on with Professor Evan Taylor at the University of Fraser Valley, not far from here, was collecting 17 oral histories from elders of the trans community. And 15 of them are people who identify as trans plus, somewhere along in that category. 2 are allies. And the oral histories themselves are quite long. They range from an hour and a half or 2 hours up to 5 hours. Mine was really long. So, that's the basis of what I have up here on the screen. So we don't expect many people are going to want to listen to those hours and hours and hours of oral histories. And we built a digital exhibit around the oral histories that gives context to them and gives you film clips from things that people talk about in their oral histories, or gives you copies of the newspaper articles, or talks about, brings in the history of the people that are mentioned. So who was Christine Jorgensen, who was Harry Benjamin, and some of their history. So it's a very nicely put together. I have to say thank you to the people I worked with on it. Amelia Smith, Michael Radmacher, Jay Watts were the main people on the team, in addition to the folks I've already mentioned. So I recommend that to you. And there's also a really nice 7-minute video. We call it 43 hours and 7 minutes. So the total number of hours in the 17 oral histories was 43 hours. And we've given you in this really snappy little video 7 minutes. It gives you a clip from everybody. And it's really quite moving. So I recommend that to you. Another current project I'm working on, leadership on this, is KJ Rawson at the Digital Transgender Archives, and there's 11 archives working together on this project, and we are digitizing content that is from IBPOC people. I know that in the US you tend to say BIPOC. In Canada we put Indigenous people first, and so we say IBPOC. So I recommend that project. It's just getting started, but there'll be lots coming out of that. And then two very recent publications that I worked on, again, on trans plus identities with Christina Olson's group. If you don't know the work of Christina Olson, I highly recommend it. She's doing a longitudinal project that looks at families who are supportive of young trans people. So these are kids who could be quite young as 3 or 4 years old, who the families understand them to be some kind of, somewhere on the trans plus spectrum, and are supporting them in that. And she's doing a longitudinal study looking at how are their lives turning out. And that study is ongoing. And she's a very careful scientist. She's very good. So working with her group, we participated in these 2 papers. One's quantitative data, one's qualitative data, that looked at what do we know so far about how many of those kids have decided to retransition. And I want to recommend to you the word retransition. I've been pushing this, and thankfully this group decided to go along with it. We see a lot of talk about detransition. Not everybody who transitions and then wants to do something different is saying it was a mistake and that I want to go back to exactly the way I was. And sometimes you can, but a lot of times you can't. People transition for a variety of reasons. And so the very, very small number of kids who retransitioned, and we're talking about single-digit percentages, some of them transitioned to being non-binary. Right? That's not a detransition, that's another transition. And it's part of stages of life. And I've talked to many adults as well who say, I don't regret what I did. Many do, but many who are in this category say, I don't regret what I did. It was learning experience. I'm moving on with my life into another stage. So some of the kids in this study, and again, there's very small numbers. When I say some, I'm talking single digits, will have started with one binary gender, went to the other binary gender, that's one retransition, and they retransition again, said, no, actually, I'm non-binary. Right? So retransition is a word I recommend to you, and here's 2 articles that we have published on that topic. Okay, so another theme in my work is sexualities of trans kids. Now, I left a glass of water up here. It's disappeared. I wonder if someone could bring a glass of water up. Thank you. I don't know. I'll take it. All right. So again, going back to the early days and coming forward, the first one I published on this was a winner of the Hugo Beigel Award from the Quad S, so thank you to Quad S. Sexual orientation, identities, attractions, and practices of female-to-male transsexuals. And again, I know the language has changed, but this was the language of the day that people used themselves and were comfortable with at the time. So a couple of quotes from this of content that was a big deal at that time, and today, not so much. So first of all, trans men tended to base their sexual orientation identities more on their gender identities and their affectional preferences. That was a big deal to say that in 1993. Another piece that comes out of there, thank you so much. That again is not shocking or even probably exciting to most people today, but at the time, to say in 1993 that 40%, so this is what, 30 years ago, 40% of participants who were 10 or more years post-transition reported being sexually attracted to gay men. So nowadays, if you spend any time in the trans men community, you'll know that there's a sizable minority who are gay identified. But 30 years ago, to come up with this data and to say this was a big deal. And then this is the closing paragraph from that article, which is, I think, why they gave me the award. Who among us have always felt so secure that they have never altered themselves to try better to live up to society's gender ideals? Clothing, coiffures, cosmetics, bodybuilding, hair transplants, electrolysis, and surgeries are all used by transgender and cisgender members of society to make ourselves more perfectly fit society's sex, gender, and sexual ideals. Perhaps in the end, the biggest difference between trans men and other members of society lies not so much in the nature of the identity-supporting processes they must pass through, but in the anguish and consciousness with which they must negotiate them. Continuing on the sexualities theme, 1994, I published something called Toward a Taxonomy of Gendered Sexuality. And this taxonomy starts with classifications based on the genetic sexes of persons in relationships, combines them with the categorizations based on those persons' social genders to arrive at a classification that I called gendered sexuality. So this got a little bit complex and convoluted, but it was trying to make sense of something that came up really in an argument with Virginia Prince at a conference. And some of you will know the name Virginia Prince. And so there were a couple of trans women there who proclaimed themselves to be in a lesbian relationship. Now, again, look at the date on this. We're talking about, well, I went a little too far. Whoops. All right, you got both of them at once. So I'm just talking about the one at the top. They proclaimed themselves to be in a lesbian relationship, and Virginia happened to know that they hadn't had genital surgery, and she said, no, you're not, you're homosexuals. And they said, no, we're gay men. And she said, no, we're lesbians. And so I'm trying to make sense of this in this article, and what I talked about was, well, on the basis of their genitals, you might call them homosexual. But on the basis of their genders, so on the basis of their sex, physical sex, you might call them homosexual. But on the basis of their genders, they're lesbians. They both identify as women. So this gendered sexuality formulation I tried to build here would say, well, they were homosexual lesbians. Right? And so there were a whole bunch of different combinations like that. It was complicated. It didn't really catch on because now we just look at gender. More recent one, 2015, that I published with one of my grad students in the Handbook of Sociology of Sexualities, was kind of a survey piece about sexualities, and I've just put on the screen the subject subheadings that we used in that article. Okay, Reed Erickson is another theme in my research career. Continue to work on studying and writing about Reed Erickson. I put his dates up there. He was a very wealthy trans man. He inherited some wealth, and then he bought some property in the southern U.S. that had oil on it. And so he made lots of money with his oil wells. And he decided to use his wealth to support causes that he believed in. Now, he started the Erickson Educational Foundation. Look at the date there, 1964 to 1984 is when it was active. And he wanted to use his wealth to provide seed money to people and organizations that he thought would make a change in society. He had a particularly good track record of picking the right people and the right organizations and the right place to put his money into things that grew. And the first place he put it in was into an organization that started well before we had the concept of gay rights, and they called themselves a homophile organization, and it was called One Inc. Some of you may recognize that or know the name. And he invested in them and gave them money for quite a long time, actually. And his investment has morphed and changed over the years, and now in Los Angeles at USC, there is the One Archives, which is the largest LGBTQ archives in the world. So he did a good investment there, and he picked a winner that turned into something that has been very valuable to the community ever since. Transsexualism, again, the language of the day, was one of his main interests. And his organization, the Erickson Educational Foundation, one of their interests was supporting research, because one of the things that he was trying to do was actually convince the scientific and research community that this was a legitimate condition of humans. You know, we're talking about the 60s, the early 70s. This was not accepted that trans people deserve to have treatment. It was a battle to convince all the scientific and medical research communities that this was not just a delusion that should not be colluded with. And so he put a lot of money into research funding, and he organized his Erickson Educational Foundation, which was usually just him and Zelda Suplee, his right arm, and a bookkeeper and a secretary, and those people changed quite frequently. And they organized the first 3 conferences of what became the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Those conferences were international research conferences. The first one was in London, and it was Dubrovnik, and then it was outside of Copenhagen. 1969, 1971, 1973. And if you count back from whatever number the most recent WPATH conference is, you get that number only if you count those first 3 in that lineage. And so when he stopped funding the conferences is when the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association formed itself in response to, oh no, we have to keep having these conferences. If Erickson's not going to support them, we need to have an organization that will. And if you look at all the big research names in the beginning of trans research, he funded everybody who became well-known and did the foundational research in this area. He also did a lot of communications, and one of them was newsletters that were published 1969 to 76, and again, there was just one issue in 73. I put one up on the screen. There was no internet, all right? How did you find out anything about trans people in the 60s and the early 70s? It was very, very difficult to do. He had the money, he had the resources, he gathered up the information, he published a quarterly newsletter. People from the trans community, people from the research community, thought these things were so valuable that still now, 50 years later, I get people contacting me through the Transgender Archives to say, I've been saving them, I can't bear to throw them out, they were so important, they were so valuable, do you want them for the archives? 50 years later, they're still saying that. Also pamphlet series, which again, this information could not be found anywhere else. It was in plain, accessible language, they had nice production values, they felt good in your hands, and he gave them away for free. And I've got a list up on the screen of the topics of these pamphlets. And again, 50 years later, people are still contacting me and saying, these were such a lifeline, I cannot bear, 50 years, I cannot bear to throw them out. Do you want to put them in the archives? They were an amazing resource. Also, again, in the 70s, how did you find a doctor? How did you find a lawyer? How did you find a psychologist? How did you find anyone who would help you? There's no internet. This is not something you can look up in a phone book and know that this is a doctor who's going to be helpful. They had a referral service. You could call the office, you could write to the office, and they would tell you 3 doctors or 3 lawyers or whatever you're looking for near wherever you were located, anywhere in North America. And they issued ID cards because it was against the law in many places for people to dress in accordance with their gender. And so they would issue an ID card that you could show the police that says, I'm doing this for medical reasons, I'm authorized. They did educational films, they did television shows, they did radio, they did public lectures. Ann Landers talked about them. They were all over the place. If you saw something in the 70s in the public media about trans people, it probably came from the Erickson Educational Foundation. And then he also had an interest in New Age movements. I'm just going to take 30 seconds or so on this. We now accept that dolphins and whales communicate. He funded the first research there. So again, he had this really good ability to figure out, well, who's doing good stuff that's really going to be meaningful and stick. He funded dream research. There's more I could put on this list, but I kept it short. Some of you may be aware of A Course in Miracles that's been translated into, I think, 27 languages. It's a spiritual guidebook, and he funded the first edition of that, something else that really took off and did well. And here's a list of some of the publications that I have done about Reed Erickson, and you can see there's another one coming out shortly. Okay, policy work is another piece of what I put a lot of time and effort into, more so recently. But as you heard, I've been a member of WPATH for a long time, so that's 30 years I've been a member of WPATH. Been on the Standards of Care Committee since 1999. I've been coordinating the translation of the Standards of Care into world languages since 2014. And I officially became the WPATH historian in 2017. I put a link there for some history that I've published on their website. So I've been an author on version 6, 7, and the new one, 8, that just came out. In number 6, there were 17 authors, and Ann Lawrence and I did the lion's share of the changes on there. And 2 changes that I felt were important was making top surgery for trans men much more accessible than it had been before. And in previous issues, there was a section in several versions that said, gender identity disorders are mental disorders. Statement. I said, I think we need to change that. And I convinced the committee to turn it into a question. Are they? And then to have the answer be, well, sometimes, but not always. Right? That, to me, I was proud of that. That was a big step forward. Version 7 had 34 authors. In that one, I went through, read every single word, edited extensively to make the language open enough that the Standards of Care 7 could be interpreted as being appropriate to use for non-binary people's requests. I could not get the committee to actually have a chapter on non-binary people or to explicitly talk about non-binary people, but I did successfully get the language opened up enough so non-binary people could benefit from version 7. In version 8, there were 119 authors, and I was a member of the Terminology Committee. Another piece of policy work I recommend to you is from the Canadian Professional Association for Transgender Health. Worked as part of a team, a research committee headed up by Greta Bauer. And we put out these guidelines, the CPATH ethical guidelines for research involving transgender people and communities. There's a little bit of work like this other than ours, but I really recommend this to you. It's quite comprehensive, it's quite carefully done, and it's accessible on the CPATH website. Anybody can download it from there. So if you work in this area, please take a look at this. If you know people who work in this area, please advise them to take a look at it. So current policy projects, those are all things I finished. So these are things I am now working on today. So one is a project looking at trans plus experiences in precarious labor and trying to look at what can we do to improve that situation. It is funded by a private foundation called the Silver Gummy Foundation. Another one is under the auspices of the British Columbia Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, and this is a project looking at how can we improve employment outcomes for trans plus people who are coming out of poverty and trying to get on their feet with some decent employment. So those first 2 are somewhat related. Another direction is working with Canada Blood Services. There in Canada, this is a national nonprofit organization. The people do not sell their blood in Canada. And we're looking at their policies on trans plus blood donors. And there's one publication that's come out of that, and there's another project that we're working on right now, interviewing trans plus people about their experiences donating blood and how can we improve that. Another project that I'm working on with a vast number of people, because this is being taken up all over the world, is we're increasingly moving into electronic health records and trying to look at how can we have all those health records in all those different places, everywhere from hospitals to prisons, to veterans associations, to the doctor's office, to the people that do diagnostic imaging, et cetera. They all have to be able to talk to each other. And how do we put sex and gender and sexual orientation into those records in a way that is respectful of everybody's privacy, everybody's identities, and also gives the medical personnel the information that they need when they need it and only when they need it. Right? This is a huge project that has got a lot of theoretical components to it, but it also has a mind-bogglingly complex implementation issues. So I'm working with people who write the code and vendors who sell the software. And so it's a big, complex project. As I say, many groups are working on it in many countries around the world. I've got a group at the University of Victoria I work with the most closely. We put out a couple of articles about it, and this is something you're going to be hearing about for many years. And then finally, another current policy project. I'm working under contract to the Correctional Services of Canada. I did a project a few years ago with the British Columbia Correctional Services to look at their policies about trans prisoners and how to improve those and make them more humane and more responsive to the needs of trans plus prisoners. Moving on to the next section, knowledge mobilization. Getting the information out into the community. So just briefly, I put a few, there's many more, examples of some of the things that I do to try and get the word out. These are videos, varying lengths. You can see some information about them up there. If you're interested, go to my personal website. I've got a section called Media, and there's links to these and many more. A couple of other examples of knowledge mobilization work that I do. These are mostly podcasts and one more video that couldn't fit on the page before. And so I do a lot of this kind of stuff. I talk to the media. Every couple of weeks I'm doing something with the media. I feel like it's my obligation, that this is a big part of my job that I should do. Right? And so I do. Okay, and the final section is I want to talk about the things that I'm doing now. A little quote from Abraham Lincoln, of all people: the best way to predict your future is to create it. And so some of the things that I've started in the last decade or so that I hope to live on well past me. And this is, I hope, my gift to future generations. So first was Transgender Archives. This kind of happened by accident. I wasn't planning on starting a Transgender Archives. But someone by the name of Ricky Swin had a research institute in Chicago that she started, and things didn't work out right. And she was living for a while in Victoria, and over lunch I said, "What happened to your institute?" And she said, "Well, it's just sitting there in Chicago, but I'm thinking about moving it to Victoria." And I said, "Would you move it to the University of Victoria? Would you consider that?" She said, "I'll consider it." And it took a couple of years, and eventually all of that stuff came to the library at the University of Victoria. But we didn't think we had a Transgender Archives yet. We just had the Ricky Swin collection. But over the next few years, one of Reed Erickson's family members wanted to donate all of his papers, and other things started coming in. And at some point we said, okay, let's call it the Transgender Archives, and let's make it official. And so we launched it at the WPATH meetings in Atlanta in fall of 2011. So we're now 11 years into the Transgender Archives. And it is the world's largest transgender-specific archives. So how big is that? When archivists want to say, how big their archives are, what they do is they describe it in linear feet or linear meters. And what are they measuring is if you take everything, all the books and all the bankers' boxes that have papers in them, and in our case we have many different kinds of other things like t-shirts and videotapes and all manner of things, and you put it, original artworks, you put it all on one big long shelf. How long is the shelf? So we estimate approximately a football field and a half. Okay? So. Thank you, Soji. It continues to grow, and it is free and open to the public. There is no charge to use it. It's an archive, so you can't take things out and walk away with them. But we have a lovely reading room, and we are in the process of digitizing, I mentioned before, a project with the Digital Transgender Archives. And we have a lot of key material that is digitized already, and we will continue to do that. So this is a shot of our web page, and I encourage you to go and take a look, and you'll see there's a tab there that says digital content, but there's lots about what we do. So again, I could spend several hours telling you about this, but there's not enough time. Another hopefully gift to the future is I started in 2014, I started the Moving Trans History Forward conferences. These are international, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational conferences. They happen approximately every 2 years. The first one I thought was going to be the only one, and people said, "I'll see you next year." And I said, "I can't do this every year, you got to be kidding." So we do them every 2 years until we hit 2020 and the pandemic happened and we had to cancel that one. And 2021 we did one that was fully online, and 2023 will be hybrid. So if you can come, I encourage you to come. Victoria is gorgeous. That's a picture from Victoria. Springtime is wonderful there, that's when we have it. The next one is March 30th to April 2nd. But if you can't come in person, it will also be available online simultaneously. Right? So we're planning on doing everything, both online and in person. It starts on a Thursday night with an opening ceremonies. Friday morning we have a plenary panel of Indigenous Two-Spirit people. We have concurrent sessions all day Friday. Friday night we have a keynote speaker. Saturday morning we have a plenary session that is an elders panel. And then we have concurrent sessions all day. Saturday night we have a keynote speaker. And Sunday morning we conclude with a panel of Trans Plus youth. Right, so please come. And the call for papers is open. If you have some research that you're interested in presenting, the call for papers is open until November 15th. And then that wasn't enough. So in 2016, I launched a chair in transgender studies. So in my intro, you heard that I was the Dean of Graduate Studies. I did that for 10 years at the University of Victoria. You can only get 10 years in Canadian universities, and then they tell you have to move on. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do next? And somebody said to me, well, start a research center. And I thought, well, I know enough about how universities work. You can't do that unless you have a lot of money. They're not going to pay for this. And many people said to me, well, if anyone can do it, you can do it. And my answer, of course, was, well, can anyone do it? And I set off to try to make it happen, and it did in fact happen. And I have a great thank you to make to the Tawani Foundation of Chicago, because they gave us a big donation to get it started. But I must emphasize, it is not an endowed chair. That donation was to get it started. So I'm always out beating the bushes for funding, so please keep that in mind. Remember us in your will, send donations. But they got us started, and that was brilliant that they did that. And so here we are now. I'm in my second term. We give, at the University of Victoria, you get 5 years at a time. So Chair in Transgender Studies now has adopted the Moving Trans History Forward conferences as part of its operations, and also the Transgender Archives. The archives themselves are owned by the University of Victoria Libraries, but there's a huge amount of outward-facing work that the chair takes on in terms of the archives. We also have a scholarships program and a fellowships program. What you see on the screen is a snapshot of our website. Those are some of our recent scholarship and fellowship winners. Scholarships are for UVic students, undergraduate, master's, doctoral students. Fellowships are for people to come and visit, to work at the Transgender Archives, or to spend some time working with me. We also have a more long-term visiting scholars program. People come in for anywhere from a few weeks to, I've had one professor from Japan who has come in 2 different one-year visits. And so the visits are varying lengths. It's a very international chair. They've got lots of people from all over the world who come in to work there. We also have a lectures series, and we do various kinds of arts and cultural events, community building events, social events. So Chair in Transgender Studies, hopefully I will finish my 2nd term and will have the funding in place to continue this chair indefinitely into the future. I hear from people all around the world that it's an inspiration to them, and so I feel an obligation to keep it alive and keep it moving. So I'm just about done here, and I want to just give you some links for how to stay in touch with us. We have Instagram, we have Facebook, we have Twitter. We have a lot of YouTubes on YouTube, and of course we have a mailing list, and we have many web pages. But if you just go to the Trans Chair webpage, and if you don't have an opportunity to catch this off of the screen, you just put Chair in Transgender Studies. It'll come up right away in Google. And everything is reachable from there. And as I said before, I'm always beating the bushes for donations. If you feel inclined, I can give you more information. And I know there's a lot of Americans in the room, and we have a 501c3, and we can give tax receipts for the IRS. And of course, we are Canadian, and of course, we can give tax receipts for Canadians. And the QR code will send you to the page. So I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. So how much time we got for questions? 8 minutes, okay. Questions, arguments, complaints? I've got a lot of light in my eyes. Is there anybody out there with a hand up? Oh dear, it's not a good sign when nobody has anything to say. Okay, there you go. Yes. Is there a microphone?
I want to thank you. Your picture as Dean in UVic is in my human sexuality text. It's inspirational. Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't hear all of that.
All right, I'll give it again. Try and keep my emotions down. I want to thank you. Your picture is in my human sexuality text years ago, identifying you at UVic. It's inspirational for all of my students who believe that they somehow can't do. You did. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, you may not be able to tell, but I'm actually kind of a shy person. And I find it, so I always have to gear myself up to be a public person. But I feel it's an obligation that I have. I've had a lot of privileges. I've had a lot of opportunities. I continue to have a lot of privileges and a lot of opportunities. And I know that it makes a difference to other people who are younger and facing more difficulties than I have faced, to know that it's possible to have a good life as a trans person and to be successful and to make inroads. And so I do this kind of thing, and thank you for letting me know that it's doing the work that I think I'd like it to see it do.
Okay. Excuse me. Oh, you got it. Yeah. All right, we're both monitoring online. From our app, we have a question. How do you see the trans plus population in the next 50 years in terms of what it is now today? So you've given us a lot of history. Where are we going next?
Okay, I like that question. I think where we're going next is kind of related to what I wrote in 1989 at the end of the gender blending book. And how I think it's related to that is that I see more and more flexibility and fluidity in gender expression and gender identities. And I think if we looked 50 years into the future, what we would see in terms of gender identities and gender expression is a bell curve. And what we'll see is bell curves have this big bump in the middle, and they have these little tails out on the end. And we'll see some people who are still quite, who are quite binary, and that is what works for them. Those are the people in the tails. But what I think we'll see in 50 years from now is that bell curve in the middle will be populated by most people, and that most people will be some kind of non-binary, gender fluid, less binary. And they may move around, but the gender expression will be very open and very flexible, and they'll still be binary people, and that'll be okay too.
I have another question from the app. They mentioned great information on trans history and advocacy. It appears the lens and thought processes in this research sits almost exclusively with a Western lens. How does WPATH account for the fact that 1,000 cultures around the world and prior to colonialism and the current neocolonialism existed in harmony with the diverse manifestations and beauty on what the West has labeled gender? That's a lot.
That's a big question. I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that. And I will point out that I can't speak on behalf of WPATH. I'm not on the board. I've never been on the board. I am on the Standards of Care Committee, and it's a big committee, and I just had a small piece to play in it. But I will say that WPATH is making an effort to be more international, to be more responsive to the fact that there is a whole world of gender, and it's not all like it is in the Western world. But beyond that, I can't really answer on behalf of WPATH, and I do recognize, and I think anybody from WPATH would recognize that it's just a drop in the bucket that's been done so far in terms of being more comprehensive and more inclusive.
Okay, hi. Extine Milrod, thank you so much.
Nice to see you again.
You know, I love you. I donated to the archive. You're amazing. But I actually want to follow up on that last question, because as we grow and as the community expands worldwide with the help of digital media and everyone knows where everyone is if you're connected to the internet, while there are a lot of people who still don't have it. Where I see WPATH is, and we've seen this in the last couple of years, is that there's been a sharp divergence where the field itself is becoming more medicalized, especially within WPATH. And I'm wondering if you, in your work, and not specifically related to WPATH, but how you're negotiating this kind of divergence where we, the community, and I as an agender person consider myself at this point part of the community, but where the community is really grabbing and taking, rightfully so, its own power, and WPATH seems to be going in a completely different direction. It's more medicalized, and it's more institutionalized, and then activists don't get a seat at the table. And so we've got this schism at this point. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, thank you. So once again, I'll just emphasize that this is me as someone who has participated in WPATH for many years. And I have, to my knowledge, I believe I have been, as long as I've worked on the standards of care, been the only sociologist on the standards of care committee. It has always been made up of service providers that have been dominated by medical points of view. And it is very much true that the WPATH is establishing itself in recent years as the medical authority worldwide. So in terms of who's involved with that, WPATH has had some Trans Plus leadership. Those people have been in support of that direction. Right? I have never been in the leadership of the WPATH, and so I don't want this to turn into me trying to defend or explain the WPATH. But I will say that in response to your question and the question before, I think that the way to go is to include and to bring in people with divergent points of view. It's not my job to try, as a person who's always lived in this part of the world, who's a white person who's had all this privilege. It's not my job to explain someone else's culture or try and understand and try and understand, yes, but not try and speak for someone else's culture. Now, I think my job is to open the door so people who are activists and people who have different cultural backgrounds to myself have a seat at the table and have an opportunity to be part of framing the direction that we go into. But I think you're right, Christine, that the WPATH has taken the role, enthusiastically has taken the role of being a world leader, wanting to be a world leader in setting medical standards, care standards. Now, I will say that there is a lot of debate about should we have standards at all, and within that, what standards should we have? And there are people in other parts of the world where they are very happy to have something like the standards of care available to them, because the fight that they are fighting in their communities is something like the fight that I was describing earlier on, where people are saying, this trans thing, that's just insanity. That's not a real bona fide medical condition that should have treatment. And to be able to say, look, there's the standards of care, there's a World Professional Association, these standards of care are used around the world, this is real, and these people should have treatment and care. That's a tool that's useful to them in some places. So it's a very complex issue about how do you straddle all these different concerns, where in this part of the world a lot of activists are saying that get rid of the standards of care, we'll make our own decisions. In other parts of the world they can't get access to care unless they have something like the standards of care. So it's complicated, and there's 119 authors this time around, and part of the reason there are so many authors is trying to bring more people to the table from different parts of the world with different perspectives. And the process, I don't know how many of you have looked at the standards of care, but the process this time, every statement of policy that is in the standards of care required 75% approval out of those 119 authors. So that's not 100%, but it's a pretty high level of agreement that people from all those different perspectives are okay with these statements. Didn't have to be, I'm 100% okay with it. Had to be, I'm willing to live with it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and we need to move on to our awards ceremony. Thank you so much, Dr. Devor.